Hey, Jeff Disher here again. Today I'm going to take a bit of a break from my usual format and do something a little different, because I'm going to talk about developer slang, some of the terms that are related to this, and situations where they come up, and ways that they kind of get used even outside of the field itself. So first of all, there's sort of a bunch of common terms. Like one of the very common terms that people hear a lot in the mainstream world is either hacking or a hack. Well, this is actually different the way software developers use it. Outside the computer industry, the term hacking seems to refer to breaking into a system, doing something kind of illegal to get access to information or software you shouldn't have. But realistically, among software developers, they refer to hacking as kind of the physical act of coding itself, building things. So actually, like hacking on a piece of code, basically, is what they kind of mean, because to them, it's about tools and building things, right? Although they can also refer to something called a hack, which is just something they just kind of cobbled together quickly. So it's like, yeah, I just hacked that together. Basically, they're just meaning they built it, and there was the act of putting it together was involved, but they actually didn't really design a solution. They just kind of hacked it up quickly, just the physical act itself, no real thought going behind it. So kind of simple things that way. And often you'll hear people say, oh, it's kind of a hackish solution, things like that. If you want to talk about the actual security concerns related to what the mainstream world often calls hacking, software developers often refer to that as cracking, or someone that gets that not being a hacker, but being a cracker, because it's about cracking a security perimeter, in a sense, as though it were a physical object. So you're not hacking into something, because that can refer to cutting wood or something like that could actually be useful, but cracking it, which could refer to breaking it, in a sense. So that term is a bit different here. The other term that you sometimes hear people use is, and it's not used in much outside software development as far as I can tell, but often you'll hear people refer to a problem as being non-trivial. Usually this is just kind of a half tongue-in-cheek way of a software developer saying it's hard. Basically what they mean is trivial problems are ones that don't really require them to think about them. They can just kind of look at the problem and immediately determine, yeah, okay, I know exactly how we're going to solve this. It's non-trivial. I don't really have to put any. It's non-trivial if it's something that you actually need to put some thought into, or really work at, or spend some time designing. So it's different that way. A trivial problem, they can just kind of hack it up. They just know it's some amount of time to be spent. But non-trivial problems actually require that they kind of put some real time into planning how they're going to do it. And another term that you especially hear this a lot if you work in companies that actually are software development companies, especially if they build tools related to software development, you will definitely hear this term, and that's dogfooding. This term is derived from the idea of saying, okay, you need to eat your own dog food. And what they mean is you need to be consuming what you're producing, quite literally. If you're building a tool, you need to be using the tool in your day-to-day work. That's actually how you dog food. First of all, it's cheaper for the company itself. They don't have to buy external software that does that stuff, but also gives them better testing. Not only better testing, but it even gives them better use case insights, which a testing system isn't going to do, because you're going to test something based on sort of what it looks like from the inside, but use cases are based on what it looks like from the outside. So that's where you get terms like dogfooding coming in. It's usually when you're building tools and then using those tools to build the tools, which is kind of neat. So there's some rarer terms that do come up as well, though. And these ones you'll see if you're kind of using technical systems, but not necessarily a software developer. For example, there's a lot of use of the term bogus, saying like, oh yeah, this piece of code or this system design or whatever is bogus. There's a bunch of problems in it. It just kind of has to be redone, which kind of lends itself to strange uses of the bogo prefix just attached to anything. So sometimes hearing terms like Bogosity, which is the measurement of how bogus something is. If you can say that there's different levels of being wrong, or different levels of kind of bug density or something like that. And also you can see this show up in situations that are fairly technical, like on Linux, for example. You want to look at the CPU info in your system. It'll actually give you a measurement of what it calls Bogo MIPS, which are bogus millions of instructions per second. And that's because there's no reliable way to measure millions of instructions per second, and there hasn't been for a few decades. So they just measure something that they need internally for some purposes, and then they report it to you just as, this is this bogus measurement we have. You can't do anything with it, but it can be useful to know what the system thinks. And then you also get into other ways of kind of describing related things that are just kind of hackish ideas. There's something called a kluge, or often pronounced kludge. The funny thing is this is actually written more often than it's spoken, so there's not really much consensus regarding how it's supposed to be pronounced. But basically this refers to something which is basically just a hack. It's kind of a, but it sounds ugly. So it's like, yeah, this is a really ugly way of quickly getting around a problem, or using something that was in the environment and kind of co-opting it in a bizarre way. So it's what we refer to as a kludge, or, okay, I kludged the problem. And it's just sort of putting in something ugly that gets the problem done so you can get past it. There's also some historical terms that are kind of neat because they keep coming up, and they've actually come into kind of broader use more recently. The term I am referring to here is Halt and Catch Fire. Now this, often just referred to as HCF, is kind of an old joke regarding how CPU instruction mnemonics work. The mnemonic is just the name of an instruction, so CPUs have instructions like add, subtract, halt, stuff like that. So there was this joke that there was this one called HCF, which would cause the system to become non-responsive and then kind of self-destruct. So it's mostly just a joke referring to really strange ways that hardware can go off the rails. There's sort of an apocryphal story involving the idea that this actually did cause a fire hazard in certain very old systems when they use core memory. Now, this probably isn't actually a correct story, but it is one that you see talked about sometimes, where the problem would occur because when the CPU halts, what it would essentially do is it would just stick to where it was and keep accessing the same piece of memory. Now, at the time, memory was actually this kind of mesh of metal cores with wires going through them. So this is what was called core memory. So if you access the same one core over and over again, it would actually start heating up, and this could cause a fire hazard. So there was sort of a joke related to that. Probably not something that ever actually happened, but still kind of a cute idea. So generally these days it refers to things that are really, really bad hardware bugs, or sometimes self-destruct instructions, because some pieces of hardware, like in military or espionage purposes, will in fact have self-destruct capabilities. So that's sort of a joke there as well. And of course, more recently, there's now even a television show called this, which is kind of based around early software and hardware development back in the 80s. So it's kind of neat that this has come to broader understanding very recently for what's kind of an old joke. Now, some technical terms, which are actually real things, which you're not going to, it's not so much a joke or something that you're going to hear much outside of the environment, but it does actually come up inside it. One of those is refactoring. Now, this is actually very similar to when you've learned kind of how to factor math equations in high school math, something like that, and you'd be able to do something like change, okay, this kind of expression should now change to this kind of expression, and that would be the factorization of it. But then if you change the original one such that it looks more like this now, you actually need to change it. Your factorization probably would look more like this, because it actually allows you to separate the terms in a way which is more meaningful. So really the idea of changing from this solution to this one is effectively refactoring. And we do the same thing in software. It's basically when you have to change a design because growth of the problem space has meant that the way you were solving it now is kind of inelegant or problematic or just hard to follow. So you would refactor it in order to make it clear what you were doing or to make it more optimal for what you were doing. There's another term which sometimes comes up here as well, which is kind of a common term, but it means something very different in a software context, and that's profiling. Profiling, in the broader sense, is a way of essentially applying prejudices to people. But in software, what you're referring to is it's really how you're measuring the performance behavior of a piece of software or hardware in response to a certain workload. So you are essentially, so the term is kind of similar in that you're trying to come up with a profile of its behavior, but only based on one thing or one kind of workload. Now you try and use a bunch of these in order to figure out how to optimize a system, but it's always going to be hit and miss. But this is basically come to mean any process through which you're trying to collect performance kind of semantic information regarding a piece of software. So term comes up a lot. Now some broader terms which actually show up in kind of other environments as well, but they're pretty commonly applied in software development, and I kind of think they're worth shedding some light on because they're actually kind of funny. The first one is bikeshedding. Now, this term is based on what's called Parkinson's law of triviality, which essentially says that the easier a problem is, the more likely other people are going to think they can solve it and then try to change your solution to look like what they think of. So the classic example of this is you're trying to propose that you build a nuclear power plant. So you take this to city council or whatever, some governing body, to ask them for permission to do this and their insights. Their only concerns are going to be about things like the yield, the safety, the cost, stuff like that. They know that the system itself is so complicated that they have no idea how it works or how you design one. So they're not going to bother you about those details. Conversely, if you were to propose to the same group of people that you build a bike shed, the argument goes that this would actually be far harder to push through, because now, sure, you have the same issues of cost and what value you're getting out of it and things like that, but also now everyone you're talking to, they understand what a bike shed is. They can kind of understand how they would build one. So now they all want to change your solution to look like theirs, even though it doesn't matter. That's not the point. This comes up a lot in software, where you might send someone a piece of code, or you'll write a piece of code and say, like, okay, well, can everyone give me their feedback? Like, everyone else in the team, give me your feedback about, is this going to solve the later problem we have, or is this going to perform well enough? And someone will give you a response just kind of stating you could rewrite part of it in this other way, which is not really better or worse. It's bike shedding. They're not helping. They think they're helping, but really it's like, no, that part of the problem's already solved. Your input here isn't really important, and it's just derailing an important conversation. So this comes up a lot, especially in companies and teams which are too large for the problems they have. People get in each other's way a lot this way. Another really weird term, which is a fairly recent one as well, and I'm only recently starting to see it show up, but it does actually make sense, is the term yak shaving. Now, this actually is derived from an old Ren and Stimpy episode from the early 90s. It was popularized at MIT through the 90s themselves. And basically it refers to any activity which you're doing to support another activity which does not actually seem directly related. Now, this might actually be important, like maybe in, say you're going to work in your car, but you now have to stop to get gas because you're running out of gas to get there. It's like, okay, the stopping to get gas, it doesn't obviously help you drive the car. Like, it's not helping you get there. In fact, it's making you take longer. But it is required because it's actually something, it gets you something you need to get to where you're going. So it's that kind of indirect value. But it can also refer to things like procrastinating. Like, you might decide, okay, I need to reorganize my garage. Well, first thing I have to do is, if I'm going to be cleaning the house anyway, I'm reorganizing it, I should clean all the floors inside first. Like, that's not obviously related. It sounds like you're just procrastinating. You're trying to find some kind of work to do which distracts you from the other kind of work you wanted to do. So this is something which actually can mean either one. Sometimes yak shaving is important because, yeah, it would have been difficult or impossible to solve the actual task without solving this intermediate one. Often yak shaving will refer to, in software, a refactoring process you need to do to make it easier to correctly implement a change. Or it could refer to any sort of procrastinating. Often things like, oh, yeah, well, I sat down to work on this project, then I realized I needed to reorganize my files. Like, that's not actually important for the most part. So those terms come up a lot. So this is just sort of a quick run through of a bunch of the common terms I hear among software developers, but also some of them come up in other situations. And they're kind of neat because they're these weird, colorful things. But anyway, if you want to leave a comment here, if you have any comments relating to this, or of course send me an email at jeff@jeffdisher.com, or if you're on Open Autonomy, you can trust me at this URL. And other than that, send me an email if you have any questions to request or any other questions relating to this. Thanks. Bye.